Welcome back to Spreadsheets and Sliders, where the GMs are sharp, the Sims are cruel, and we're all just looking for spreadsheet glory in a virtual world.
We're your hosts. I'm Aaron Mariners, and with me is Jacob Red Sox. In classic top shelf fashion, we had a flurry of moves right up until the deadline, including a number of big names. We're here to break that and more down for you.
We're also excited to introduce our rising contenders this season and incorporate some of the new stats that are available to every scouting department. For the first time, OOTP has given us a deeper look into advanced metrics used by real MLB analysts, which is perfect for the stat geeks here at Top Shelf.
A quick note as well to start thinking about those playoff rosters as we push toward the end of August. It seems that some of these division races will be tighter than ever, and we can't wait to see how the postseason shapes up.
And as we begin this episode of Spreadsheets and Sliders, we're going to talk about the Atlanta Braves, who unfortunately, after winning a division title in the NL East last year, are down in the basement 11 and a half games back out of first.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate that Atlanta's fallen off this year, especially because they had claimed one of the biggest international free agent names last year with Zaijiro Ida. He was listed as a right fielder, but he's really turned out to be a little bit more of a DH because even though he's being played in the outfield, he's not able to hold his own.
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate. Ida actually isn't even starting right now for the Braves. Is putting up decent offensive numbers in 86 games, has a 111 OPS plus at the time of recording, but he's just been so poor in the outfield that he hasn't really found a spot to stick since the big trade acquisition of Daniel Cuvée last year has had him occupying the DH on both lineups.
Yeah, Ida has a minus 11.6 zone rating across three positions right now. Most of Ida's hitting metrics are still pretty strong within the 60th, 70th percentile ish, especially for his power numbers. But he's tracking to be on pace for about 10 home runs and 39 RBI, which really isn't anything to write home about, especially when you sign the guy to a 3 year, almost $60 million deal this past offseason. I would have probably expected Atlanta to be a little bit more active at the deadline in selling just because they're so far out of first place right now. We mentioned in the opening podcast this year how they have a number of players on expiring deals or who are late in their salary arbitration. So, for instance, Trey Savage is on an ARB number, Michael Harris and Austin Riley are expiring. Even Cuvée is on his last couple years of arbitration. All of these guys could, be great pieces to ship off for some either reclamation projects or top prospects or just some younger controllable assets for Atlanta, just so they can put something together and take advantage of Acuna, Schwellenbach, Henderson, and Baldwin as that core still together.
Right there in the lower portion of the NL East is unfortunately also the New York Mets. Now, they're actually pitching a little better than we expected coming into the season. Their starters ERA is actually under 4 at 5th in the NL, and they've performed mostly well with basically only their only top shelf talent being Irving Coda. Unfortunately, the rest of the roster hasn't really kept up with them. They are 13th in runs scored. Their bullpen is nothing to write home about, with 13th in ERA in the NL. And this roster did actually make one move at the deadline, which may signal a change in the roster construction going forward.
Yeah, the Mets did end up shipping off their closer, long term closer, Edwin Diaz, off to San Diego in what most have seen as just a huge salary dump move. The Mets are very far back in their division, and even though they've had some promising performances from some of their acquisitions, most notably Samuel Basayo is still going to be around league average this year, even though it's a slight step back. He has really strong metrics, almost a 500 X slugging, and he's in the top 80th percentile for a lot of his other power metrics. But unfortunately, that's just not enough for the Mets to compete this year. So they shipped off one of their most expensive assets in what might signal a bit stronger of a rebuild going into this next offseason.
Yeah, the Mets also going to the next offseason will have about $105 million available after that move. So they do have positions to kind of shore up the rest of the roster by buying some pieces if they really want to. But we'll have to see what the GM wants to do because that financial flexibility could also signal that they want to start moving away some of the longer term contracts after the first domino has already fallen.
Now, in third place in the NL East is the Washington Nationals, who are a game over 500, but still a game and a half back in that NL wildcard race.
Yeah, Washington really is the start of this kind of three-headed division beast at the top of the NL East. These three have basically been jockeying for position all year, and I kind of expect that to continue through the rest of the stretch run as each of the Marlins, Phillies, and Nationals have, made a couple of moves to shore themselves up the deadline. The Nationals specifically targeted some pitching help. They picked up David Hageman, closer from the Minnesota Twins, who has been really good for them. And one of their early season trades was for, and excuse me if I mess this up, for Raijeti Merite from Cincinnati, and he's been pretty solid for them as well.
Yeah, Washington's rotation right now is actually looking pretty strong, even though they are rated the eighth best starters ERA in the National League. It's just mostly because Noah Schultz is having a little bit of a step back from last year. Fortunately, Washington is getting a huge contribution from their third year ace, Mason Murdock. This year, he's putting up his best season as a pro. We are only 24 starts in, and he has 6.7 WAR. He's on track for nearly 10, and that's by tracking for a 19-7 record with extremely elite metrics across the board. Murdoch is honestly one of the most exciting players in a while to come out of the Washington organization. And I'm really glad that recently the Washington GM was able to sign him to a 7-year extension worth $189 million.
Honestly, those guys are going to be end up carrying what has been mostly a mediocre offense for Washington. They do have some bright spots there. Of course, the ever-present James Wood, who is putting up another MVP level campaign in right field, is anchoring the middle of the offense along with second baseman Angel Feliz. But it's really a focus on the number two ranked bullpen and the starters for Washington to carry them into the postseason.
Yeah, Feliz was an all-star snub this year, and I thought that was a huge robbery against the tremendous work that he's put up for Washington. He's currently among the lead leaders in home runs, only one behind Kazunori Kawasaki of the Chicago Cubs. And he's tracking for 4.2 WAR despite a lackluster fielding performance. So if Washington can leverage his performance into a deep playoff run over the next couple of years, then James Wood will still be able to contribute at a high level while his contract is still pretty team friendly. It'll jump up to 45 million a year in 2034, which is about 10-15 million up from what he's getting paid right now, and that could limit the Nationals a little bit once he gets there. But in the meantime, they do still have a little bit of money available in order to take advantage of this financial window.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how they build out the rest of the offense going forward. For the rest of this year, I think that the anchoring of Wood, Feliz, and also Carson Williams, who was signed to an extension a little while ago, will be pretty solid and can get them through a couple of postseason series. But for sustained success, they're going to want to supplement that strong pitching with a little bit of a better offense, at least something that's above average. So we'll have to see how Washington continues to build. But for the rest of the year, I really like the moves for Hageman specifically at the deadline. I think that he really helps lock down the end of the bullpen. And actually, he's being listed currently as a stopper for Washington. So that means he's filling a more multi purpose role in all the high leverage positions. And I think that's a great way to use a guy that is that good with that level of pedigree.
Oh yeah, 100%. Only a game and a half behind the Phillies, who have made quite a few additions at the deadline this year, adding, let's go down the list. Second baseman Fabian Lopez from Boston, Sorahiko Shichida from Boston, Sean Lignan from the Chicago White Sox, Victor Arias from Cincinnati, most recently, and Sterling Paddock finally made his way back to Philly from Baltimore after not having the best season in Philadelphia before.
Yeah, it's funny because the Philadelphia Phillies have actually had a couple of homecomings with Paddock and Tsuchida, but I really, really, really like the aggressive moves that their GM has made at this deadline. Philadelphia has been one of those teams that we've kind of been a little critical about. They've been kind of in that limbo spot for the last couple of years where unfortunately they just haven't been able to, compete when they've made win now moves. And at the same time, they weren't necessarily so bad that they were getting top three, top four picks. But really this year, I think a lot of those things that are coming to fruition. The aggressive signing in the offseason of Ogneslav Ali has paid off wonderfully. He's pitching just like an ace for them in his rookie year. I have him after all the scouting has settled down at a 63-67, but he's pitching extremely well in his rookie year, has even better underlying statistics than his actual performance, suggesting that he could go even better. And I think that specifically the additions of some starting pitching help plus the supplementation of the offense with Arias and Lopez and really help these guys push the top of a very winnable division.
Yeah, it was really smart of them to go out and get a couple of starting pitchers. Currently, they are rocking a 4.41 starters ERA, which is good for 13th in the National League, unfortunately. It's really just the back part of their rotation that hasn't been pulling its weight. Bales at the front, along with Ali right behind him, have been fantastic. But a couple other things to note for Philadelphia is the resurgence of Jose Corona, who they signed as an international free agent last year. And he had an okay rookie campaign, putting up 13 home runs and 56 RBI in about two-thirds of a season of games. This year, however, he's projected to go far past that: 33 home runs, 90 RBI, projected to score over 100 runs this year. And that's after a position switch. This year, he's doing a little bit better at first base, and he actually landed his first NL All Star award at first base.
Corona has been a big turnaround for the Philadelphia, and I think that this is one of those catalysts that kind of changes the way that their moves are over the last couple of seasons have been viewed. Because if he was going to be another one of those busts, unfortunately, it was just going to kind of be in a line of moves that didn't pan out. But the fact that he's panning out along with Ali is really helping this team kind of push towards the top. And for the first time in a while, they're above 500, and they look like a real contender.
Yeah, the Phillies are pretty fortunate right now too because they're in the red financially, so they were able to pick up Arias, Lopez, Paddock, and Sachita fully retained, which is a huge deal because of how much is currently being funneled into Ali and Corona right at the top there. Speaking of Ali, he's been pretty much worth the money that Philadelphia has given him. I mean, $67 million a year is nothing to sneeze at, but he's age 25 and he's actually still qualified to be the number 42 overall prospect because of his age and lack of experience. This year, we're seeing the potency of Ali's pitch mix. He is really throwing four pitches, but two of them are far and away above the rest.
Yeah, Ali is primarily consisting his arsenal of the cutter and the curveball, which he throws about 73% of the time between the two of them. And with all of those pitches, he's has a profile that generates a ton of movement. His basically the pitch that probably moves the least is his changeup. He has a cutter, a curveball, a changeup, and a split finger. So all of those pitches are contributing to a 29% whiff rate, which is really, really good. Good for a 74th percentile average. So when you have a guy like this with a unique profile that's succeeding in baseball, that gives you a weapon that no other team has.
Now, finally, at the top of the division is the Miami Marlins. They are 2 games ahead of Philly right now, 8 games over 500, and they also made a couple of additions at the deadline, mostly in the relief pitching.
Yeah, the additions of Jacob Bresnahan from Detroit and closer Cheng Hao Guao, the hero for the White Sox World Series run last year, will really help shore up that bullpen. And I'm really happy to see Miami make some moves because it's been, they've been one of the better teams in Top Shelf's history, but over the last couple of years, they've kind of waned a little bit. They've kind of been in and out of the postseason picture. And unfortunately, with the limitations you have in that Miami market, I was starting to get afraid that there may be some issues maintaining a competitive team. But I also know that the GM for the Marlins is very active and very aggressive. So seeing these moves made should really help a team that has the fifth bullpen ERA push up into that elite tier, maybe top three towards the end of the year, and hopefully use that pitching to carry them to a postseason berth.
Yeah, Miami is in pretty good position right now. We know from talking at the beginning of the year that they suffered a lot from giving up Davison De Los Santos a couple years ago to Chicago, and they really needed to find another source of power in their lineup. It was remaining to be seen whether John Cruz's season last year was a fluke, and honestly, so far, it's looking like it was. He is only projected right now to put up 19 home runs this year in almost a full season of at bats, which is nothing compared to the 38 home runs and 112 RBI he put up last year. But they had traded for Kevin Tamburini, who hasn't produced as much after the trade. But fortunately, one of their top prospects, Kevin Robledo, has come up and put up some really good numbers for them, which we also touched on earlier as a potential source of power for them. He's currently at a 96th percentile hard hit rate at 31.2%, and he's rocking a 201 isolated power despite only a 201 batting average. So even though they've lost a little bit of power from John Cruz, they're getting a little bit of it back with 26 projected home runs from Robledo. And hopefully that helps keep the Miami offense afloat as they march down the stretch here.
Yeah, a lot of power can help make up for some of the deficiencies in getting on base and some of the batting average. And Miami does have its power kind of balanced throughout the lineup right now. You've got basically 7 out of the 9 lineup spots looking at double digit home runs currently and projected for more. So we're hoping that that balance can help push them towards being a little better than 10th overall by the end of the season.
and they have the rotation to make it work as they get later in the year. Varys has had another strong year. Johnny King has come up and done very well in his third year now, and Eric Yeager is still there at the top of the rotation. That's a great three-headed monster. If you really have to, you can fall back on Jonathan Russell, who's done pretty decently, and Carson Milbrandt's been there for a number of years now. So even if they go into these long playoff series, Miami's pitching is at the very least looking deep and poised to make a run.
Shifting gears to the NL Central, let's talk about the number one seed and far and away currently the best team in the NL, the Milwaukee Brewers. Now, they didn't make too many moves at the deadlines. Actually, I believe they made no moves. But, when you're sitting on a 72 and 40 record, which is, I believe, 10 games, 9 games actually, over the next highest record in the National League, you don't really need to do much.
Milwaukee's working off the back of an extremely strong pitching staff right now. The extension to closer Jose Fermin has turned out to pay off in a big way this year. Just now, he's at 30 saves in his first full season as the closer, projected for 43 saves and just barely above a 2 ERA. That's going to win you anywhere. And he has great ratings by my scout. He's still 61-61 at age 30. He's as consistent as it gets over the last 3-4 seasons. And when you pair that with an offense as potent as this one, who is first in the league in batting war and second in runs scored, Milwaukee's still going to be the team to beat.
Yeah, I mean, really, we say this every year, but Milwaukee has assembled one of the better rosters in all of baseball, and they've got star level talent kind of studded everywhere. Logan Webb is having another stellar year here in Milwaukee, a little bit of a step back from last year, but when you say that a 3.30 ERA and 1.21 ERA plus is a step back, you're starting from a pretty good spot. You also have guys like Caleb Denzason, who hit 47 home runs last year, again tracking for almost 40 with 38 at the moment. You have another 23 home runs from Cam Smith. And then you still have guys like Julio Rodriguez sitting there with a lot of talent and a 117 OPS plus in the middle of the lineup.
Yeah, and Milwaukee's doing this without one of their main contributors over the last couple years in Zach Showalter. I know that he has been a key bullpen contributor for a few years now, and he tore his UCL in spring training this year, which was hugely unfortunate for Milwaukee because he's most likely not going to make it back for the end of the season. We're going to have to see him back at the beginning of next year. Fortunately, it hasn't been that big of a deal because Milwaukee had one of their top prospects, Bill Horton, come up this year and be a huge threat in the bullpen. He not only has 50 stamina as a reliever, but he has one elite pitch in that 98th percentile fastball with a pretty decent splitter where the league is only hitting 202 against him so far this year.
One thing I need to point out about the Brewers, though, that has haunted them in the past is unfortunately that injury bug. We have talked about Showalter, but ominously, they do have two major contributors right now on the IL with unknown return dates. Jackson Churio has been out with a strained MCL since 6/26. It is currently August 9th in game, and he is having a fantastic year. I mean, he's hitting 327 at the time of his injury. He had 17 home runs, a 934 OPS and already 4.2 WAR. At the same time, Ryan Taylor had pitched 19 starts to a 260 ERA and a 154 ERA plus. Both of these guys are the types of guys that can swing postseason series. And so I am really, really interested to see if these guys can come back and get healthy before the stretch run and before the playoffs start. Moving on to the second place team in the division, we have the St. Louis Cardinals. They've been jockeying back and forth all season with the Chicago Cubs for first and second place, but right now they're sitting at a 57-55 record, but didn't do too much at the deadline.
Yeah, they were pretty quiet at the deadline, and that could just be because they have a solid roster to begin with. They're currently sitting around 500 right now, but their roster's a little bit deceptive. Most of their counting stats are middling or below average compared to the other teams in the National League, and a lot of that comes down to consistency across the board. Currently, St. Louis is 12th in home runs, and the majority of that is coming from Facundo Velasquez, who is their superstar center fielder. Past that, Jordan Walker has 15, Sean Well has 12, and then it's just a bunch of single digits. And when you're not knocking the ball out of the park, you can't take advantage of a second best in the league on base percentage at 323.
Yeah, they're getting a lot of traffic on the bases, but unfortunately, it's not translating too far above average in terms of runs scored, where they sit fifth in the National League. I'll be interested to see how the Cardinals kind of turn towards the stretch run, as the guys that they've looked at for contributions over the last few years have, kind of had a little bit of a down year. Like Jordan Walker is still hitting very well, still well above average, but down from his peak years in 2029 and 2030, where he was one of the absolute world beaters here in Top Shelf. And he's only tracking for 22 home runs after missing a few games.
Fortunately, though, for St. Louis, there is a little bit of hope left in the return of their star, JJ Weatherholt's coming back off the IL. He's missed about 6 weeks now, hasn't played since the first week of July, and he's been a great contributor in his time there. He's coming up on his last year of arbitration. He will be a free agent after this year, and it'll remain to be seen whether St. Louis decides to extend him because he's been a great young player for 5 years, developed a reputation as a fan favorite, and produced every single year on offense.
Right behind the Cardinals are the Chicago Cubs. They're sitting at 55 and 57, just a hair below 500, but they've been as high as 5 or 6 games throughout the season. And it's been sort of a mixed return for the Cubs after seeing their, sort of experimental roster, as we mentioned at the beginning of the year. They are absolutely far and away blowing teams out of the water with the number one home run hitting offense. But beyond that, there's been some mixed returns.
Yeah, this is about what we expected when we saw the Cubs roster at the beginning of the season. First in the NL in home runs, 15th in the NL in strikeouts, having crested 1,000 already by August 9th, which is crazy for any team in the major leagues, especially a team that's actually competing. But this is kind of what we expected coming into the year. And fortunately for the Cubs, it's left them in a pretty competitive spot in a pretty decent division. And you really have to look at their all-star catcher this year, Cade Arambide. He's been fantastic on offense and defense, tracking toward 4 WAR and being one of the biggest surprise stories in the major leagues.
Yeah, Arambide has been really impressive. Tracking right now for 25 home runs, even in a technically abbreviated rookie year of he's basically provided everything you want from a starting catcher, especially as, just a second year. And he's really come out of nowhere considering that his ratings by most scouts aren't super high. It'll be interesting to see whether or not he can continue this through the end of the year. But right now, a catcher that can sit at the 5 spot in the lineup and a lineup as technically prodigious as this Cubs lineup is really, really impressive. One of the things I want to highlight, though, is the Cubs pitching has been a lot better than we maybe expected coming into the season.
Yeah, the Cubs, especially off the back of that bullpen, have put together a pretty strong staff this year. Now, after acquiring Yumin Lin from the Blue Jays, I don't know if Chicago was expecting to get a significant contribution out of him since he ended up in the bullpen toward the end of his last year in Toronto. But he's ended up being pretty good here in Chicago in his third year. None of the starters have been far and away blowing people away, but they still have the sixth best starters ERA in the National League, and that's off the back of a number of ground ballers and relying on really strong defense behind them.
Now, before we move on, I know that we've had some clamoring from the viewers, and specifically one viewer, about talking about some players more in depth. So I do want to take a second here to talk about Kazunori Kawasaki, the de facto star here of the Chicago Cubs. Now, he's having a bit of a down year in comparison to last year and his rookie year, but he is still offering elite power numbers with 31 home runs, currently leading the National League, tracking for 45 by the end of the year. Now, those are great numbers overall, but he has such an interesting profile because he is not a great base runner, he's not a great fielder, but unlike pretty much anybody else you see in baseball, he is at the literal top of every single metric that you can possibly put to measure power. 100th percentile exit velocity, 99th percentile max exit velocity. He is the best in the league at converting home runs to fly balls. He's the best in the league at getting the barrel on the ball. He's the best in the league at hard hit percentage. Every time he makes contact with the ball, it goes so far. Unfortunately, this year he's not making as much contact as he did last year. He is somehow tracking to break his record last year, 266 strikeouts with a projected 276. So I'm looking to see if Kawasaki can get a little more of the bat on the ball as the Cubs go into the final stretch. Because if he can return to a bit more of a complete hitting profile as he's had in the last couple of years, the Cubs will go far.
I think we both know that he's not going to be getting the bat on the ball anytime soon, right off the back of a 44% strikeout rate. Even though he has been really good for the Cubs, he didn't make the All Star team this year off the back of those power numbers, unfortunately. And he is still right there in the middle of the lineup. But the Cubs have gotten some great contributions this year. With great performances ahead of Kawasaki from both Sean Gamble and Jefferson Rojas, Rojas is looking at another MVP type campaign, now in his fourth straight All Star game and in the second year of his 5 year extension, which at $25 million a year is honestly pretty affordable for the amount of production that he's put up. Even though the Cubs didn't do anything at the deadline to improve their offense, they did get rid of one notable player in relief pitcher Bobby Burkhold. They traded him over to San Diego, and I know that the GM wasn't super high on Burkhold, even though OSA ended up having Burkhold at 80-80, I just saw the other day, which is ridiculous for anyone moving at the deadline. Fortunately for Chicago, they don't really have a need for another righty specialist in that bullpen. Ryan Harbin, since he went over there, has been excellent. Also, Alex Martinez, who's been there for a long time now, is pretty much dependable for a sub 2.5 ERA on any given day. And now Jack Couch has made his name known in the major leagues after being a top prospect for a few years. One of the really interesting things this year is how Cincinnati has reclaimed a little bit of their fan base in improving their record, currently at 48-64, which might not sound like much to most of us, but that's a huge improvement on the last few years.
Yeah, I think your point about the fan base is super interesting too, because their market has never been very strong, but their interest is actually quite high for a team with such a low winning percentage. Currently showing a 63 on interest, which means that they're getting a lot of fans in the gate. So it's really exciting to see that and to have a more active front office and direction for the franchise after they've been kind of directionless over the last few years. We had a few moves for them here at the deadline. They did trade away Victor Arias, and Merite was moved earlier in the year to Washington. So Cincinnati doesn't have too much earth shattering stuff to do, but with a lot of money opening up next year and with a lot of young talent getting time in the majors, their rebuild might start getting some real direction soon.
I know that they were trying to ship off a number of other players at the deadline and didn't get any bite there. Bryce Terang, notably, didn't move. Trey Morgan didn't move. Alejandro Gaspar, who's been there for a few years now, didn't move, and a number of the pitchers. And so, since he's still a pretty veteran heavy roster, but the thing that I am really looking forward to for Cincinnati uh, is the development of a few of their prospects. This year's first overall pick, David Ayala, was a shortstop who came out of Puerto Rico, and he's still an A ball right now. I think he is well developed past A ball because he's rocking a 1410 OPS. He's tops in every single metric across the board, and even though his ratings aren't major league ready, he's on the doorstep. He could be there as soon as next year if all goes well. The challenge for him right now, I think, is just going to be having the support around him because Cincinnati, like I said, is a pretty veteran heavy roster right now. So if Ayala comes up and he doesn't have, protection in the lineup, or if he doesn't have strong pitching to supplement his offense, then his development will be stunted a little bit. But he's only been here for a few months. He has plenty of time to develop into the superstar that I think Cincinnati hopes he'll be. We're going to wrap up the NL Central by discussing the Pittsburgh Pirates, who are 29 and a half games out of first right now and on a 6 game losing streak to begin the month of August. Now, year in, year out, Pittsburgh hasn't been very good recently, and that's super unfortunate because they were right on the cusp of the playoffs only back in 2029. And this year, they finally made the decision to part ways with their ace of the last few years, Paul Skeens, in favor of some younger arms, especially Trevor Hanson.
Yeah, the Skeens trade has unfortunately been a long time coming, and you really hate to say that about a developed player and a franchise player for one of these smaller market teams. But unfortunately, the Pirates just weren't able to get over the hump in the regular season. This year, at least, Skeens has been able to provide them with some decent prospects back, and I think that this should maybe signal the Pirates are a little bit more open to trading some pieces away. Maybe come again towards the off season to see if they can push towards that bigger rebuild because they've had a very elite prospect system for a number of years now. It's just that whether or not those guys can come to the majors and get developed in time to all, sort of line up for a competitive window.
Yeah, there's a couple things that I think the Pirates just really had out of their control. One of them that I know we've discussed in previous podcasts is the development of one of their former prospects, Edward Florentino. He came into the majors. We thought that he might have a huge power campaign when he came up, and he did in 2030. He ended up with 28 home runs and putting up a 452 slugging, and he fell off an absolute cliff since then. I don't really know where this came from, but his ratings have completely cratered. He went from 46 with 60 realized power, and now he's at 38 with 45 power in not even 2 calendar years, which is incredible in a negative way, obviously, because Pittsburgh needs all the offensive help they can get. And they're not getting a ton of contributions from the corpses of O'Neal Cruz and Carter Jensen either. So you really have to hope that the Pirates can field a respectable offense in the coming seasons. You just have to wonder where it's going to come from.
From one embattled franchise to another, we're going to move over to the NL West and talk about the Los Angeles Dodgers. Now, they're definitely not in the same boat as Pittsburgh. That's not what I meant to imply. But unfortunately, they're having the same sort of issue they've had for the last couple of years. They're once again an above average team in terms of runs scored. They're sixth in the NL currently, right after the deadline. But unfortunately, their pitching just simply cannot get it together well enough to support them.
No, Roki Sasaki's still putting together a pretty good year. And finally, Wilson Anderson has come up to pitch to a pretty decent degree of success in his first full year in the majors. But past that, they don't have a lot in the bullpen to support the starting pitching. 14th ranked bullpen, 11th ranked starting rotation. Troy Taylor was who the Dodgers brought over this year to be their closer. Used to be on Seattle, moved over to Anaheim, and now he's finally with the Dodgers. And he was really good for his first two teams. This year, he's not really doing a ton for the Dodgers, but it could just be a team wide thing. One of the bright spots, though, for the Dodgers has been the play of their right fielder for the last few years, Braden Montgomery. He's having a career year on offense, putting up elite metrics in every category. And even though he's really more of a strong platoon bat over a full time power threat on both sides of the plate, this is going to be his second to last year in arbitration, and he's still on a pretty decent number. He's eligible for about a 10 million ARB estimate. So he's still a pretty decent candidate for an extension. But if the Dodgers want to play off of his performance this year, he could also be a sell high candidate.
Yeah, I think Montgomery is going to be one of those guys that kind of signals to the rest of the league what the Dodgers' intentions are going forward. Because as you mentioned, he's having a really great year. He's not quite at the heights that he had a couple of years ago offensively. He had a year where he hit 42 home runs and 106 RBIs for the Dodgers in 2029. But he's still a player that's right in the middle of his prime at 29, is a switch hitter, even though he has a little bit of a bias towards one side, and is putting up elite run value and hitting metrics. So when this offseason comes around, I would be really interested to see whether or not that extension comes around or if he gets moved in a deal. Because if he does, it sort of signals to me that the Dodgers are finally looking towards like a real rebuild. Because unfortunately, these small adjustments that they've been trying to make over the last few years have not translated into a postseason berth in a very long time.
Yeah, the Dodgers currently boast one of the older rosters in MLB. They only have a handful of players who are below age 30 on their major league roster, which is not the greatest position to be in, especially when you've got this much of your payroll locked down in those veteran players. Yoshinobu Yamamoto has fallen off a little bit this year, starting with really last year. Marcelo Meyer, who's signed for another 5 years, really isn't doing a lot this year. And the Dodgers' international free agent signing from last year, Atsuhiro Mukai, their starting catcher, he's been okay. He hasn't really been a great value for the contract that they gave him, though. He currently has put up only .3 WAR, but he is in the 87th percentile in fielding runs. Put up a 9.8 range factor, 3.7 zone rating, and is throwing out nearly 40% of runners, which is very impressive for any catcher, especially one that appears to only be rated about a 45 in catcher arm. So you can offset a little bit of that lackluster offensive performance, but for a 33-year-old that's making 17 mil a year, you could really do a lot better than that.
Yeah, fortunately, being the Dodgers, you can absorb, sort of more of these above market contract values in order to fill out your margins. But we'll be looking at the Dodgers to really make some bigger adjustments if they want to push back towards the postseason, since their division is so competitive.
Yeah, right above them in the standings currently is the San Francisco Giants by a few games, 5.5 games to be exact, because the Giants have gone on a run in the last 10 games, going 9-1. And for the last couple of sort of trade cycles, the Giants haven't done too much. really haven't done much in the way of trades or off of free agent signings. The most notable thing is that they had re signed Yoshitsugu Moriguchi this year after letting him walk in free agency last year. He had put up a pretty good career so far with the Giants, but no one had picked him up in free agency because he had that qualifying offered to him last year, and people didn't want to give up that compensation pick. So, as it turns out, the Giants were able to re sign him for a couple of seasons at a much lower price than they would have had otherwise. And he's still contributed in a positive way, hitting in that top third of the lineup.
I really think that he's one of the least of the worries for the Giants right now because they have had and continue to have a very good pitching staff overall. They have the fourth overall starters ERA and the sixth overall bullpen ERA at 3.59. Across that roster, you have most of these pitchers doing pretty well, but unfortunately, it's been the offense that's created this year. 14th in runs scored, so almost last in the majors, and they're looking at pretty bottom barrel metrics overall from pretty much everywhere. Only two players right now in their lineup are hitting over 10 home runs and no one over 20. Moving on from the Giants, we have another trifecta of very competitive teams at the top of the division. This time here in the West, we have the Rockies, the Diamondbacks, and the Padres, all separated by currently just one game, with the Rockies and Diamondbacks actually tied at the top of the division. We'll start with the San Diego Padres, who made a flurry of moves here at the end, right up at the end of the deadline.
Yeah, San Diego was pretty impressive in how they handled their trade deadline this year. They went through and decided that, hey, if we're going to compete at the end of the season, we need to improve our bullpen in a major way. And San Diego, in the history of Top Shelf, has been known for having one of the better bullpens in the National League. Traditionally, they're in the top three, top four of bullpen ERA. This year, they're down to eighth, which for most teams is still a pretty solid contribution to a winning organization. But for San Diego, that's a disappointment. And even though they have managed to hold on to some of those mainstays uh, like Luke Little and Jeremiah Estrada, some of the other pieces around them haven't pulled their weight as much. And so San Diego went out, got three major relievers in Bobby Burkhold from Chicago, Yohan Duran from Cleveland, and Edwin Diaz from the Mets.
Yeah, those three reliever pickups are actually really, really interesting to me because all three of these relievers are super high potential and overall type of guys by pretty much every scout's ratings. But also, all of them haven't put up super high numbers this year, which is, I think, partially why these guys were available. For me, the most interesting of the three is Bobby Burkhold. He's actually one that's quite divisive among a lot of the top shelf community. And after being traded from Seattle to Chicago, he shows all of these elite ratings, but he hasn't really been able to put up super elite numbers since 2030.
Yeah, Burkhold's still really good. I know that this year he's put up a 4 ERA so far with Chicago. Last year was a similar deal, but he was really good for me in his first year coming into the major leagues. He's still gonna be good. He has two very elite pitches. He's a ground ball archetype. I think one of the things to look out for is his effect on the clubhouse. I know that at least when he was in Seattle, he was listed as selfish with high financial ambition and low loyalty. I don't know if that transferred over to Chicago or not, but it's just something that San Diego is going to have to pay attention to, especially if they consider extending him. But we also have to point out that San Diego is doing this despite one of their moves blowing up in their face at the beginning of the season. If you recall, Jacob, one of the biggest moves of the offseason was San Diego picking up Ben Joyce. And that was a huge deal at the time because I didn't think Anaheim was going to get rid of him. It really wasn't something that was on my mind. And he got to San Diego and immediately got hurt, and then he went on his rehab assignment and got hurt again. And that's super unfortunate because Ben Joyce is still on the books for another 4 years. And he's been good at times for Anaheim. He's been a great reclamation project there. But unfortunately, San Diego has tied up a lot of the money in that. And they've been able to get by with their current rotation. Some of that actually has to do with how Billy Carlson is back in the major league rotation after being a hitter primarily for his first couple years in the big leagues. And I know that their GM has had mixed feelings about making Billy Carlson into a two-way player again, but at least by the peripherals, he looks like he's doing pretty well so far. Could depend on his health going forward, but he's extended for another 4 years, and it's really anyone's guess as to where he puts most of his focus.
Yeah, Carlson, we already know has a very, very high ceiling, right? Just a couple of seasons ago, 2030 won the National League MVP with a 7.8 WAR season, having a 30 home run campaign at shortstop. The last couple of years, he hasn't been as prolific with the bat. He's been closer to league average. And for me, I think the fact that Carlson has that pitching ability sort of helps mitigate when he's unable to put it all together at the plate with his profile. And right now, he is providing a lot of positive war for the Padres, and we'll have to see whether or not his fragile tag is going to impact them because, like you said, that injury to Joyce is kind of a big one considering it impacts their depth. And now, with Carlson having to pitch more of a full workload as a starting pitcher, there's not as much room for error for the Padres.
The Diamondbacks also made a notable addition to their bullpen because for the first time in a little bit, they are very competitive at this point in the season. They're currently 63 and 49 to put them 14 games over 500. And like you said, they're in a tie for first place right now in that National League West. They ended up going out and picking up Franco Elman from the Detroit Tigers, who was having a below average season. Last year, he had a much stronger year, and the year before that was pretty similar. So Arizona is looking to supplement their bullpen by picking up one of the, not elite, but definitely one of the better available relief pitchers.
Yeah, a lot of their success has kind of been tuned to the fact that they've finally had the players that they have on their roster sort of put it together. I mean, they're fourth in the National League in runs scored with a very good offense that's balanced across the board. The only thing that they're really significantly below average at is home runs, but they do have a few power hitters in the lineup between Adriel Radney, Zach Green, and AJ Gracia, and they're really, really good on the bases. Corbin Carroll is leading the way, but overall, they're first in stolen bases in all of the National League.
There's actually something I noticed here when we're looking through the Diamondbacks that's probably a huge inspiration across the league. Jacob Steinmetz, we've gone over him a few times now because he developed the rect tag at age 27, and that was super unfortunate because it was when he was coming off of his All-Star nod in 2029. He put up 208 innings, 6.3 WAR, and then he pitched a combined 150 some innings over the next two seasons, which was obviously super unfortunate because he was the de facto ace in Arizona. This year, he actually, in spring training, after our first podcast, outstandingly completed strength and conditioning to go from wrecked up to fragile. He actually improved, which means that currently he's on pace for a career year 6.1 WAR with 218 innings. And that's obviously extremely impressive for anyone, especially someone who's still an extension candidate on a competitive team. But most notably, this means that Arizona's rise back to competition this year wasn't just a fluke. They actually do have one of their big pieces over the last few years able to contribute at a high level.
Yeah, and on the offensive side, Zach Green has really led the way for Arizona. He did have a bit of a period where I think about 6 weeks he got hurt, but the rest of the time he's been on the field, he's been absolutely one of the best bats in baseball. And really, his percentile rankings among offensive leaders is just really a sight to behold. Pretty much everything here is elite. And with a development of 69.73 by our scouts, he's really one of the best complete hitters in baseball. And at just 24, not even in arbitration yet, he should be an anchor for the Diamondbacks for many years to come. Moving now to the division leader, tied with Arizona at the moment, we have the Colorado Rockies. Now, I waited years at this point to say this, but we finally have a contending Rockies team that is no longer just some sleeper candidate. This is real.
We might have Rocktober. Yes, the Rockies for the last 3 years have won 77, 77, and 75 games in the last 3 years going back. And that's by no fault of the rest of the NL West. The Diamondbacks haven't done very well. The Padres just sort of took over the division as they scaled into it with some of their prospects developing. But the Rockies have always had a lot of money to spend. And finally, they were able to do so this year by trading for Skeens, signing Christian Campbell long term, and extending Alexander Albertus, which is a huge deal because he and Charlie Condon are still going to form that really, really potent offensive core for years to come. And that's exactly what GM should be doing when you have really, really strong performers that are still on minimum deals or on ARB deals, like both Victor Cavazos and Carson Capraro, their star catcher who took absolute leaps and bounds when we swapped over to OTP 27.
Yeah, and I have to say, I really, really love the Rockies deadline. They had some really big moves. Now, they did trade for a reliever to help shore up that bullpen. They traded for Aaron Bummer from Seattle, but they took two big swings at this deadline. They traded for starting pitchers Paul Skeens and Corbin Burns. The Rockies are first or second in pretty much every offensive batting statistic. Their issue, as it is with pretty much every Rockies team, is the pitching. And the fact that they picked up not just one, but two proven starters to help solidify a rotation, plus a solid bullpen arm in Bummer, is all you would want out of a GM when you're looking to address weaknesses in season, pushing for a division title. Now, on the other side, I want to talk a little bit about someone in that prolific offense, Victor Cavazos.
Yeah, Cavazos is an all-star this year. He is still going to be on a minimum salary for another season, and he was a huge prospect coming up through the Rockies system. He was drafted second overall back in 2029 and developed pretty quickly, only getting to the majors a couple of years ago. But he's been really, really strong on offense since he got to the majors, and now he's actually putting it together in the field as well, putting up elite defense at shortstop.
Yeah, Cavazos is leaving a bit of a sophomore slump that he had last year, totally in the rearview mirror. He's right now putting up a super elite number in OPS plus at 134. He's tracking for a 7+ WAR season at the moment, off the back of that mentioned improved defense. But he's got such an interesting profile that I have to highlight. At the moment, right past the trade deadline, in just the beginning of August, he already has 43 doubles, and it's contributing to a hitting profile that is so interesting. At the time of recording, Cavazos has 41 doubles and 8 home runs. However, this is already translating to a slugging percentage that is eighth in all of Major League Baseball. It's higher than the National League leader in home runs, Kawasaki. He's a player that's hitting so many extra base hits, and it's contributing to an elite slugging percentage without leaving the ballpark. And that's not something you see every day. In addition, he also has a really complete hitting profile versus all pitch types. He's not negative versus any type of pitch.
Yeah, Cavazos has been a complete revelation for Colorado. I'm really glad that they were able to pick someone that high up in the draft and actually have him come through in his development, which, as we've seen in Top Shelf, isn't the case with a lot of these top picks, especially in this most recent draft. I know that some of the word going around was that the draft classes in the newest version of OOTP were going to take a bit of a hit, but fortunately, Cavazos was able to bypass that, having been drafted a couple of years before this switch. One of the players, though, that got the biggest bump in ratings was the not quite an all-star Carson Capraro, catcher for the Rockies. He is in his second year in the big leagues right now, but he made a tremendous jump, especially in the power ratings once we made the switch to OOTP 27. From my scout, he went from a 49.75 to 72.79, which is meteoric compared to what anyone would expect from honestly any player, especially a young guy. And now Capraro is in the 99th percentile of both barrel rate and expected batting average, as well as the 100th percentile in expected slugging. Anyone who's in Coors Field with an expected slugging of 644 is a player to watch for years to come, especially when you're a, switch hitting catcher with decent fielding. This is a complete steal for Colorado, and between him, Cavazos, and a couple of the other young guys, they really are looking good for the next few years. Now, Colorado may be the talk of the town in the National League, but in the AL, it's the rise of the Las Vegas Athletics. Coming into the year, they had just barely made the playoffs last year off a tiebreaker, but before that, they'd been in the cellar for quite a few years. Fortunately, this past offseason, the A's made a number of really important moves, none more important than signing Bobby Witt Jr. out of free agency.
Yeah, the Bobby Witt deal really seemed like the signal of a new era here in Las Vegas. And it's so impressive to see what's been built here. They're one of the most dominant teams in baseball, honestly, up to this point. They're really, really good in pretty much every facet of the team. Looking deeper into that bullpen, you can actually see that their high leverage guys are actually doing quite well.
Yeah, Brennan's been really good. He's already up to 34 saves on the season, and Vegas was pretty smart to bring in Mason Fluharty from Toronto last year. He was fully retained, and he was already performing at an elite level for a few years in a row, filling in for Eric Reiselman every time he got hurt. But he came over and he's been great in the setup role. Now, the biggest free agent acquisition besides Bobby Witt Jr. was one of these international free agents, 28-year-old Hiromoto Mukai out of Japan. He was signed for $112 million, and he's been an absolute legend this year. 38.6% strikeout rate, puts him in the 100th percentile, 99th percentile in expected ERA at 1.65, and he's only given up 2 home runs in 55 innings pitched. Now, unfortunately, this sim actually, he developed some inflammation in his rotator cuff and he's going to be out for 2 months. Now, that's going to line him up right with when the playoffs start, so he might be able to come back in time for Vegas to make a playoff run, but right now, they're going to have to rely a lot on some younger guys to help fill that void.
Fortunately for Vegas, they've been doing nothing but winning all year despite some of the other middle relief issues. I want to really talk about this offense because not only is it balanced across the board, the only hitter that doesn't have double digit home runs actually is Bobby Witt Jr., who is still putting a positive run value. But across the entire roster, everybody's getting some contributions in. Specifically, stars from last year like Slade Caldwell and breakout stars like Santiago Leon.
Yeah, Santiago Leon's been very good this year. I think he's done a lot better than he was expected to because he was a Rule 5 pick a couple years ago. But he actually ended up making the All Star team this year as the third baseman for the American League. And that's off the back of a very strong offensive campaign. He is hitting 326 so far, which in today's day and age is extremely rare, which means that it puts him at a very high value, both as a 24-year-old minimum contract guy and a guy that can hit for both power and average this year. The guy that I want to point out too as well is Melvin Matos. He was the number 17 ranked prospect coming into the season, and he's developed a really strong profile with, at least by my scout, 75-80 gap, 65-65 power, and 80-85 eye. He developed that eye right when we switched over to OTP 27. He was previously at 60-85 and jumped a full 20 points, which made a huge deal in his development because it immediately propelled him to the major leagues.
Yeah, Vegas is a really big example of a rebuild that is currently bearing fruit. We're seeing a young team put it all together right in front of our eyes. And part of that also is here in the rotation.
Yeah, the rotation is still very scary. We mentioned last year how it was just starting to come together. Marco Solis had been coming off of 2 consecutive 200 plus inning campaigns. And we know that Mark Barnard had been shopped around and then decided to stay in house. Now, on top of Barnard and Solis, who is actually taking a huge step back this year, Vegas went out and got Leonardo Rondon right before the season last year, and he's turned out to be fantastic. He's slotting in right there at the number 2 position in the rotation, and unlike a lot of top shelf elite starters, he actually does a lot of his work at the top of the strike zone. He still maintains significantly above average home run rate despite an extreme fly ball tendency, and despite his fastball being elite at 97th percentile in run value, he is only throwing at about 40% a game, which is one of the lowest rates among qualified starters. Fortunately, as we've mentioned with their rotation, there's a couple other big names to throw out there. David Jenkins, the first overall pick from a year ago, has jumped right in there and fit in seamlessly. And one of the big names from the last few years of production in Vegas, Wei-In Lin, is just about to come off of his rehab assignment. Only one game behind them is the Anaheim Angels, who, along with Texas, has been at the top of the division for the last few years. And that's off the back of the number 1 starting rotation in the American League.
Yeah, the Anaheim rotation has been really impressive even after the departure of Ben Joyce. Bobby Miller there is leading the way at the top with Roy Reedy, Jeter Martinez, Will Sanders, and the one that got away from me here in Boston is Dominic Duncan, who has been absolutely nails for the Anaheim Angels since being traded there, continuing to have another elite season, probably his best one ever at the moment, with a 2.56 ERA currently tracking for almost 200 innings. The Angels continue to be an elite organization. I mean, we didn't really expect them to be anything but first place in the division, which is kind of stunning. But, you're looking at their metrics, everything here still checks out as what you would expect. The roster is still complete top to bottom. There's power everywhere. They're first in the American League in runs scored. They're first, actually, in starters ERA and second in bullpen ERA. Everything here checks out as being one of the best teams in baseball. And it's so exciting to see an elite team, an established team like this, fighting at the top of the division with an up and comer like Vegas.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic right now, too, because Ellie De La Cruz, the premier star of the league for so many years with 3 MVPs under his belt, is actually having a down year, and Anaheim is this strong in the standings right now. Ellie in a down year is projected to put up 29 home runs, 47 steals, and still 5.4 WAR, which is absolutely ridiculous. But his ratings are starting to slip a little. He's gone down by my scout 6 points since the beginning of the season, which is a little bit concerning. I think if I was the Anaheim GM, I would just be a little bit concerned moving forward. Keep an eye on him. Maybe he needs to be platooned a little bit harder, or maybe he just needs a day off here and there. But he's still one of the absolute premier players in the league, and he's on a really good deal. $32 million a year for a player of that caliber is well worth the money.
Absolutely. And I actually want to point out that, part of that offensive dip a little bit, and again, we say dip kind of with a grain of salt. He is still tracking at a 121 OPS plus, so well above average. But part of that offensive dip could be a little bit from him playing a not new, but unfamiliar recently position in shortstop. Ellie has actually been excellent here at shortstop, putting up 94th percentile run value, great zone rating at almost a 6, having played it at 30 years old for the first time in a number of years. And the fact that you can, slot your MVP third baseman, your three-time MVP third baseman at shortstop and get positive results fielding wise is a gift in and of itself. And so we'll have to see if he stays at shortstop for the rest of the deal, or at least in the near future for part of the deal, whether or not his bat, comes back and adjusts after getting used to the position.
Unfortunately, one of their biggest rivals over the last few years, Texas, has fallen back this year. They're currently at 500, 56 and 56, which is not a bad record, but it still puts them at 16 and a half out of that first place spot. It actually puts them in a tie for the second wildcard spot because either Vegas or Anaheim is going to end up taking that first wildcard spot more than likely. Texas didn't make too many moves at the deadline here, but they did pick up one key piece in center fielder Drew Jones, who came by way of Seattle. He's played elite defense for years now, both in Arizona and Seattle, and he's going to slot in immediately as that starting center fielder, likely moving Daniel Flames either to the bench or back down to AAA.
Yeah, the acquisition of Drew Jones allows Sal Frelick to move to one of his more natural positions in the corners and should help shore up that defense. Unfortunately, the Rangers have kind of just been bitten by both the injury bug and a bit of the regression bug. If you track them actually throughout most of the year, they were for a time right with the Angels and Athletics, within 3, 4, 5 games of them. But it's only recently that they've fallen off a little bit, as unfortunately, some of their biggest contributors are just not having great years. Tyler Bremner, who was absolutely excellent last year in an abbreviated stint, 18 starts at a 151 ERA plus, 266 ERA. This year in 23 starts, 5.28 ERA. He's just not getting it done. And the power numbers across a lot of the Texas lineup are not what we're used to seeing. I mean, Josh Springer, Nick Kurtz, and Ezekiel Tovar are all as consistent as ever. But around them, the less proven names are not contributing to the level that we expect. In addition, they seem to be dealing with quite a few significant injuries. Wyatt Langford, who is one of the better players, he has currently 26 home runs actually, is currently on the injured list for another week. He had a broken collarbone. Lyndon Harrington, who was a trade from Boston a couple of years back and has been one of their best relievers, especially in leverage, is out for another 3 months still. Like, he's not going to make the playoff roster and he's not going to be a factor this year. Yuri Perez is banged up. David Sandlin is out. There's just names, unfortunately, that Texas seems to be bitten by that injury bug.
Yeah, it's been pretty unfortunate. Like, for instance, like you mentioned, Tyler Bremner is having a down year, but he's also fragile. He had that abbreviated season last year, and that could be a sign of things to come. Unfortunately for Texas, he's still an excellent pitcher when he's on, but Texas signed him for 6 years, so he better get it together because at age 28, he's not getting any younger. The fragile tag, unless he goes through some really successful dev programs, isn't going to be going away anytime soon. So Bremner needs to step it up. I know that with the injuries in the rotation, that Texas has relied a little heavily on Chris Cornwell, who was a big free agent acquisition over the offseason a few years back. And I know that that GM is very proud of that move.
Moving further down the AL West, we have the Houston Astros. Now, they're hovering around 500, which is a little bit better than we've seen in recent years, but they're a rebuild that's still finding their footing.
The Astros are only 2 games under 500, but their roster is kind of polarizing in their performance. The rotation has been awful this year. A 4.67 ERA in the rotation, which contradicts the sheer talent that rotation boasts. Georgie Larson has been the talk of the town since he entered the league 3 years ago. Talon Haley is on a really, really downward trend. Hector Mancilla is hurt, but he's also putting up his worst season as a pro. And Fernie Gonzalez also putting up a terrible season. I think the light at the end of the tunnel here is a couple pieces in the bullpen. The high leverage guys for Houston have actually performed pretty well this year. Angel Peralta, their closer, has a 14.4 K per nine, which is exceptional, especially, elite at that level. And even though he has the fragile tag, in his first full season as the closer, he's performing up to everyone's expectations.
I think Houston has had an extremely sound strategy in the draft in recent years by picking a lot of these top arms when their team at the time was devoid of all this arm talent. But these guys need to start performing. I mean, Georgie Larson, again, we've talked about him so many times, but he's just one of those guys that there's so much raw talent, but he's simply not converting it into run prevention right now. He's not even walking that many guys in comparison to his career average. And finally, we move to the last place team of the division, the Seattle Mariners. Now, it's been quite the documented fall since the days of Seattle winning, an average of like 106 games per year. But every team needs to go through a rebuild in its time. And right now, Seattle is trying to do that.
Yeah, the biggest acquisition for Seattle this past offseason was the blockbuster signing of catcher Kyle Teal. He came into free agency after a World Series title with the White Sox, commanding a colossal deal, and Seattle gave him a 6-year deal with an opt out after year 4. He's not worth a ton on the payroll this year, but next year his cap number goes up to about 53 million, and that's just to average out with a couple of the other salaries on the payroll. Zach Neto's heavily front loaded. Benny's front loaded a little bit. Cole Young's number goes down about 20 mil after this year. But the key pieces of the roster are aging, so this competitive window needs to happen sooner rather than later. The rotation is not as strong as it was last year. Jose Davila, who was a Rule 5 pick, has proven that his first season wasn't a fluke. He's still putting up a 3.37 ERA. Cameron Appenzeller, who came over in the Kageyama trade last year, has proven to actually be pretty good, developing into a 48-61 pitcher with a 99th percentile run value on that slider of his. But unfortunately, a lot of the offense has fallen flat for Seattle, other than the base running and stolen bases for the year.
We're seeing an interesting mix of veteran talent and young prospects coming up. And if the Mariners want to return to the top of the table and make that competitive window happen sooner rather than later, as mentioned, with these free agent signings like Zach Neto and Kyle Teal, it's going to be off the backs of some major development of these prospects.
Yeah, Jamie Darcy was a huge get for Seattle last year from Philadelphia, and he put up a tremendous rookie campaign looking to repeat in year 2, which that's all you can ask for a rookie or a young player is that level of consistency. Fortunately for Seattle, they also have quite a few players who are getting into the higher level minor leagues right now. Alex Alonso played third base in the majors for 74 games this year before he started slumping, and now he's sitting in AAA. Alexis Gaona, a number 14 overall prospect in Major League Baseball, just hit AAA, and Seattle's number 1 draft pick this year, Jacob Morris, out of College of the Holy Cross, has been doing pretty well as a 2-pitch starting pitcher in AAA. I think he's going to take another year to grow and hopefully develop a pitch in the offseason, but signs are looking good so far for Seattle to hopefully get some youth into that roster next year. Now, over to the AL East, it's been a little bit of a rough division this year. Only one team is above 500, and that's unfortunately only good for a 64-48 record. Tampa was doing pretty well for a while, but they lost 10 in a row, and now we're just here with Boston at the top. Boston sold off a couple of pieces, and they've really been the tale of two worlds, with the 12th ranked starters ERA, but the first ranked bullpen ERA.
Yeah, Boston is enduring a bit of a strange year so far. While most years I can fairly safely say that we've been pretty strong contenders, even with the record that we have, there's a lot of issues that are currently happening at Fenway. Like you said, the 12th ranked starters ERA is a bit of a problem considering that the rotation stalwart Kikuo Fujioka has just been enduring a career worst year. Now, part of that it does seem has been chalked up to some bad luck. He's by far enduring his worst year in terms of BABIP. It's almost, I think, 40 or 50 points over his career average. Most of his other underlying stats are around his career averages. So on my end, I'm hoping that he can maybe bounce back next year because he's being let down by his defense. But just overall, the rotation has endured a lot of adversity. Unfortunately, we also just took another hit with one of the only other consistent starters this year. Kumar Rocker is now out a full 9 months after tearing his UCL. So we're not going to see him for another year. He's going to be age 34 by the time he's on the mound again. And that's a big blow for a team that's not fielding any other starter other than their number four with an ERA under four.
Yeah, Yanagita's actually been really good. He's been up and down since he came over to Boston, but at least Boston has had the benefit of having him on a really cheap deal. 8 years, 70 million when he came out of Japan at a really young age leaves a lot of room for growth, definitely a lot of room for inconsistency. Now, fortunately, Yanagita's year this year has him posed to hit 4.3 WAR. Off the back of a 3.62 ERA up to this point. So that's at least a positive sign for Boston's rotation. Unfortunately, like you said, getting dealt another heavy blow by losing Kumar Rocker for the rest of this year and the beginning of next year doesn't help the cause at all.
One of the pieces shipped out was Fabian Lopez, who was going to be hitting arbitration this year and was unfortunately going to likely be one of those cap casualties for me. So I decided to put him up for auction at the deadline. He also wasn't putting up a great fielding run value after putting up a gold glove for me last year. So at that point, I was hoping that maybe we could get a couple of assets back and see what the team might look like next year.
Yeah, Toronto, on the other hand, is somehow in second place. Their GM has been away for a little bit, so it was a quiet deadline for Toronto. But with Tampa falling back, Toronto has jumped into the number two spot, and they've had an interesting season to say the least. Dylan O'Reilly, their superstar for the past few seasons, has taken a monstrous step back on offense, putting up negative 19.4 batting runs so far, on track for negative 27.8. So far, he only has 16 doubles on the year, and he has somehow already stolen 35 bases with a sub 300 OBP. So at least he's putting up some value, having been the face of that franchise for a few years. But Toronto's had some big losses this year. Somehow, Eric Reiselman is healthy, which makes no sense because Toronto has lost time for Chris Hampton, who was their best hitter for quite a while, and he's been out since early July. Jesus Dominguez is their starting first baseman. He's going on the IL right now. And arguably their best starting pitcher to start the season, Malachi Gay, tore his elbow ligament and he's going to be out for the next little less than a year, which is super unfortunate because the starting rotation was actually doing pretty well up until that point. Carlos Contreras is having a pretty decent year, and the first round pick for Toronto this year, Nick O'Connor, actually immediately jumped into the major league rotation just out of need. He's only given up one home run in 47 innings, which is excellent, especially for a young pitcher. But even though he doesn't have super developed ratings and super developed pitches, he is still putting up a decent season for his first year in the bigs.
Yeah, and another thing about Toronto's season is that I do want to point out that they are actually only about a game and a half out of that third wild card spot. Now, they're not exactly the betting favorite with teams like Houston and Texas above them right now to take that spot, but I think that kind of speaks to how the American League's third wild card spot has been over the last couple of years. It has really been one of those like kind of up for grabs spots. And with a team like Toronto, who does have a few shining pieces around kind of a flawed squad, it'll be really interesting to see how they play their offseason because they're definitely trade candidates. They have prospects that they could try and either leverage or move up. Like they have guys like John Shamblin who are getting ready to get to the cusp of the majors. But their front office is sitting on about, $90 million of free money, not counting what they do with their arbitration cases. So depending on how maybe the last part of the season goes, if they can sneak into the playoffs or stay within striking distance, there's a real chance that this offseason could be a more aggressive one where they spend that money on perhaps a wild card superstar from the international pool or maybe take on the salary of a bigger star from another team that could really push them back towards a real contention window. Moving now to the Tampa Bay Rays, they've been a super interesting team this year because for a little while they were actually very close to challenging for the AL East crown. There's definitely still time, 2 months left in the season for them to turn it around, but they just endured a completely disastrous July, and August doesn't seem to be looking much better right now. They went 9-17 in July and have started August with a 7 game losing streak. In totality, a 10 game losing streak.
Yeah, fortunately for Tampa, they do still have that young rotation to lean on. Over the last year and change, their star prospect Alex Aguilar has come up to the majors and turned heads with just how strong his performance has been. This year, he's had a quality start in about 80% of his starts. At age 21, that's unbelievable. There's nothing you can ask from a pitcher more so than giving you innings and performing at an elite level when you're that young. He's among the league leaders in his pitching run value, both with his fastball, his off speed pitches, and his breaking pitches. And he's throwing at 100 miles an hour, which is also top tier in the league.
Yeah, Aguilar is actually one of only a few pitchers in baseball that have a 90th percentile or better on their entire arsenal. He's also got a really, really interesting approach and maturity to his game. Now, he's a young guy, right? He's got developing pitches that aren't fully there for strikeout stuff. He's only currently striking at 8.3 per nine, which is good, but not great in the context of, developed major league starters. However, he's getting a lot of success this year by forcing soft contact in the zone and by pitching to very specific parts of the plate. He really likes using that high fastball up in the zone, and he also loves to pitch in the bottom right corner, which is low and away versus righties and low and in versus left-handed batters. And it plays well to his slider, changeup, and forkball as the breaking pitches.
Yeah, Aguilar has been nothing short of a superstar for this Tampa Bay team, especially a young team that's been looking for success for a few years now. They've come off 3 straight seasons with under 70 wins, and they're already at 52 coming into this recording.
Yeah, the most important thing for Tampa Bay will be kind of evaluating what this core can do towards the end. Now, they definitely have the talent and showed earlier in the season that they can get into that wild card spot. And with themselves being only 4.5 back of the third spot, there is definitely a chance for them to push there again. But especially with the rotation that, for the most part, we know is reliable, I'll be looking for them to really spend their off season and making their next moves geared towards shoring up sort of the weaknesses in the margins of their team. Their defensive rating is okay, but their defensive efficiency is quite poor in the context of the American League. It's ninth. So that would help a lot of their pitchers when they have a roster focused on young and talented pitching. As well, their offense is still below average. Now, it does have a lot of players that are prospects or former prospects that have come up and are kind of finding their way in the majors. But I'm hoping that with a little bit of money free this offseason, that maybe they find a bit more of an established bat to help stabilize that part of the team.
Yeah, Tampa did acquire right fielder Danny Wallace from Detroit this year, which I thought was a really strong move on their part, mainly because he's still 25 years old on a minimum deal. He has a little bit of growth to go, but most importantly, at least by my scout, he has 70 power versus left handed pitchers. And when you have that combined with a little bit of speed and definitely some strong defense, Danny Wallace is looking like one of those players that at least I personally would want to build around. Unfortunately, I think Tampa was hedging on him returning to his form from a couple of years ago. Last year, Danny Wallace put up a 761 OPS and the year before a 715. This year, between Tampa and Detroit, he's only around a 550 or so OPS, which is well below what anyone could expect him to be at. So, at least with one more year on a minimum deal and being fully retained by the Detroit Tigers, Tampa at least has a very low risk option here in right field that they can hopefully turn into a major asset moving forward. But the AL East is still a very competitive division, so it's going to take a little more than Danny Wallace to get Tampa Bay into that upper echelon of the Boston Red Sox and maybe the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, Baltimore is also dealing with a bit of a conflicting message in their team identity. They did really well as recently as 2030, having made the wildcard team, albeit at a record under 500. But last year they didn't do very hot, finishing third in the division. And this year they are 15 games under 500. They're definitely not looking very good this year, especially on the offensive side of the ball. As we got toward the trade deadline, Baltimore did signal a little bit more of a sell off, even though they do still have some strong pieces on their roster. Most notably, Sterling Paddock went back to Philadelphia, and then Cade Povich and Creed Willems made their way over to Chicago a little bit earlier than the deadline. And Willems had been really good for a couple years. We mentioned in the preseason episode that he had sort of taken the place of Samuel Basayo as that catcher in waiting, DH in waiting, that was going to be able to at least give Baltimore a little bit of a power stroke while they developed some of their prospects. But they decided not to re sign him and instead shipped him off to Chicago.
Yeah, a lot of these trades are Baltimore trying to extract some value out of the valuable pieces left on their roster. Unfortunately, it just seems like some of the moves that they made in response to trying to make that wild card, as you mentioned, have just backfired on them a little bit. The big albatross in the room, unfortunately, was the acquisition of Fernando Tatis Jr. He was picked up last year at the trade deadline from Philadelphia, and he actually hit quite well for Baltimore. He posted a 137 OPS plus last year in that time, hit 10 home runs, and he was looking like he might be one of those veteran pieces that could help anchor this Baltimore lineup. Unfortunately, this year that just hasn't been the case. Since then, he's dropped, I think, by my scouts' estimation, about 8 ratings points. He's currently hurt again, and he's posting a negative run value and a negative fielding value. He's just all over, been unfortunately a bit of a disaster. And with a lot of money being committed to this player, it's been a tough season for the Orioles, who I think expected, and we expected them to be better than they currently are.
Yeah, but fortunately, the Orioles do actually have some pretty decent prospects coming up within the next year or two. One of their prized prospects over the last 4 years or so has been Brandon Teferi. He's currently the number 15 prospect. He's still only 22 years old and he's raking in AAA. His develop's going a little bit slowly this past season. He just went up to 42.71 by my scout, and his batting ratings could all still use a lot of work before he moves up to the big leagues.
Finally, in the AL East, we have the New York Yankees. Now, unfortunately, there's not too much to say about this team. They're very much deep in a rebuilding cycle at the moment. Currently, only have 38 wins at the start of August. And that's, honestly kind of by design. I mean, this team has needed a reset for a little while, and they're looking to be picking up one of those top 3 picks if possible. A lot of these pieces on their roster are going to start coming off the books in the next few seasons. So the Yankees have currently a lot of money, and they are going to have a lot of money in the future. It's going to be up to their draft and free agency to see if they can rebuild that roster from the unfortunately sorry state it's currently in.
Yeah, the Yankees, it was a little bit weird when we went into the preseason episode because the Yankees did that huge influx of outfielders, if you recall, from free agency. All of them very expensive. They brought in Angel Martinez, Evan Carter, Dylan Cruz, and Dawson Brown all at the same time, and none of them have performed so far this year. Dawson Brown is only putting up .2 WAR in 78 games. He's not even playing full time. And even though he's putting up great defense in center field, that's not worth the 12 million that they're paying him this year and 2 more years on the books. Dylan Cruz, who was formerly a top prospect and a great contributor on the White Sox previously, has put up an 88 OPS plus this year and negative rating defense. Like, that's not going to do it either. Evan Carter is the most expensive of all of these guys, and he's put up a 52 OPS plus over 80 games, which isn't going to cut it. So the Yankees, little bit of a bizarre turn for I think what we expected to be a little bit more successful this year. But like you said, a lot of this is by design, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Defense and pitching are not the name of the game for teams that are, you know, competing, but also, as we all know, not really competing. And the Yankees are doing as good a job as any, as, like you said, going for that top 3 pick.
Moving finally to the AL Central, let's start here at the bottom with the Detroit Tigers. Now, the Tigers made a couple of moves here at the deadline, trading away a few pieces to pick up some assets, but there have been some unfortunate backfires on some of these aggressive trades that the Tigers have made in the last few seasons.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Tigers are in a bit of a sorry state right now. Over the past few years, they have not gotten above 77 wins. And I think going into that 2028 season, they were really hoping for a lot more. A lot of that came off the back of that trade for Ethan Holiday at the trade deadline in 2029. And he's turned out to be really good. Over the past few seasons, he's put up pretty good numbers on offense, albeit at the cost of a little bit of defense. But last year's 5.5 WAR season with 33 home runs is looking a little suspect if you compare it to this year. And fortunately, he's still young, but Detroit wasn't really able to take advantage of those first few years before arbitration, which is really unfortunate. Fortunately for Detroit, they do still have a couple of younger guys coming up. Aaron Rhodes has come up to play second base. Jeremy Cooper has come up to play third base. And one of their catchers, Jose Ramirez, has just hit the majors as well.
Yeah, the youth movement should be soon in full swing for Detroit. Unfortunately, some of the moves that I really thought were panning out for them earlier in the season just haven't quite stuck around as being that good. Tristan Casas has been a decent pickup in lieu of having Spencer Torkelson, but he's not really moving the needle too much for the Tigers offense. They're still stuck tied at 12th in the American League in runs scored. And another player that unfortunately is having a not so great year is center fielder Xavier Rico. He was picked up a couple of years back in international free agency, but as one of the older prospects coming in from international waters, he's just taken a bit of that step back this year, not quite hitting league average OPS plus after posting a 116 last year, only tracking for .8 WAR. And guys like this, veterans, are going to be relied upon on most teams to really contribute. And when you have guys underperforming in the offense and in the rotation, it's just not great overall. In addition, there's a lot of team injuries here. You're seeing at least 6 people on the injury report at the moment. Guys like Sal Stewart, who are pretty big pieces of the offense. Byron Churio is one of the better pieces after a trade from Minnesota in 2030. He's on the IL as well. It's just unfortunately just been beat after beat for the Detroit Tigers.
Now, I think we all thought that Kansas City was going to do a little bit better this year. I know that in the previous episode, we discussed that their star second baseman, Graham Seaberg, was expected to take a leap this year in the power department, and that simply hasn't happened. 2 years ago, in his rookie campaign, he put up 24 home runs with a 182 isolated power. The next year, it went down a little bit, and this year so far, he's only put up 8 home runs in 107 games started, which is unfortunate because that's just tracking for 12 home runs on the season. Now, fortunately, he's only hitting arbitration this year at age 23, and he was an all-star last year. So that means that they're primed to have a really strong, really young player for years to come. And off the back of letting go of Bobby Witt Jr., that's exactly what Kansas City needs in order to develop that new young core moving forward. Unfortunately, this does mean that they'll probably still be not super competitive for another year or two, just while their talent develops. But there's still some bright spots on the offense, and the rotation does still have 3 starters at the front that are putting up pretty good numbers.
Yeah, the rotation is still headed by Mozicato, who is basically the de facto ace here. He's been very, very good in Kansas City over the course of his 5-year career, and he's putting up another solid season. He definitely benefit from a little more help in the field, as unfortunately Kansas City is one of the bottom teams in terms of defensive ratings. They have 11th in defensive efficiency, 10th in zone rating, and 9th in errors. But despite all that, he, Christian Scott, and Joe Power have all been putting up pretty good numbers. This is the second year for Joe Power as well in the majors, and he has a lot of good things that you like to see from a young pitcher. He's really good at limiting hard contact, and he's really, really coming into his own in terms of his off speed arsenal, especially since, funnily enough, a 23-year-old in the majors has a 25 developed fastball.
Yeah, that's not something you see every day, especially when you actually have velocity and power can throw 95 to 97 right now.
Next on our list is another team in the AL Central that has been a bit of a disappointment, but honestly, in recent times, has been on a bit of a hot streak with a 9-1 record in their last 10 games, the Cleveland Guardians.
Cleveland's actually been pretty good. Now, they do have a couple things that are going to be held against them this year. Most notably, they're getting a lot of stunted growth in their prospect department. Very, very extensive injury report throughout all the levels of their minors. And that's really unfortunate because Cleveland's only 7 games under 500. If they just had a couple more contributors on the major league level, then they'd be right up there at the top, with Minnesota being able to compete for a division title. Unfortunately, they are not. And that's off the back of a really inconsistent bullpen and a really, really front loaded rotation. Fortunately for them, though, the money that they threw at Kazufumi Kuriyama is definitely not going to waste.
Yeah, absolutely. Kuriyama has been excellent in his follow up to his Cy Young campaign in his rookie year. Kuriyama, now that we have the benefit of these extra advanced stats, actually has one of the most interesting profiles in all of baseball. He actually, in comparison to other starters, barely throws his fastball, barely throws his breaking ball, but he's in the 98th percentile in amount of off speed pitches thrown. And he has a lot of pitches. That off speed is consisting of a splitter, a forkball, and a changeup. And that means that 33.2% of the time, batters are getting one of those three pitches, and they are absolutely unable to hit them. He is living at the bottom of the zone. He has always been the kind of guy that is a ground ball pitcher, gets a ton of ground balls. And the fact that all of his pitch types have positive run value means that using all of these movement pitches at the bottom of the zone means that he can back it up with that fastball being more effective and that slider being more effective when he mixes them in.
Yeah, Kuriyama in his first 2 years in the league has won a Cy Young. He won the Rookie of the Year last year, and he just came off his second All Star nod. He's been nothing short of incredible for Cleveland, and it's a real bummer that at 31, they haven't been able to make more of his contract so far. We saw the benefit of an older but very expensive ace in Fujioka for Boston and the impact that that can have on multiple title runs, being able to really solidify a rotation that had some weaker pieces to it. And Kuriyama's goal is no different, being right in front of Tim Catucci, who for years now has sort of been that ace in waiting.
Yeah, and I also want to point out Cleveland is living in, this fairly weak bottom part of the American League where they're only 3.5 games back of an actual wild card spot. Now, it's not a guaranteed thing that they could leapfrog all the teams in front of them to get to that spot, but the fact that they're within striking distance and still have pieces that are geared towards postseason success, like Kuriyama and Katucci, tells me that if they can maybe squeeze a little bit more out of their offense going into the back half of the season, that they maybe sneak into that playoff picture. Next, we'll move on to the surprise second place team in the division, the defending World Series champion Chicago White Sox, who had actually quite a busy trade deadline.
Yeah, the last 3 years they've made the playoffs. Last year, obviously, winning the World Series. And that was a pretty surprising season, at least for a lot of the GMs in the league, because the previous year they got swept out of the wild card in a really, really weak AL class, having made the playoffs 6 games under 500. Fortunately for them, they've been able to capitalize on what's been a pretty strong offseason going into this trade deadline as well, having picked up a number of really strong contributors, keeping Mackenzie Gore around from last year, being able to bring in Justin Berry last year to get full time at bats, like we mentioned previously, and then being able to sign both Emmanuel Rodriguez and Logan O'Hoppe to be part of this squad this year.
Yeah, and I think it's also really interesting that the White Sox seem to be in a phase where they're pushing towards a bit of a retool. I think the word you just used, surprising, it really describes what this roster was built for. I mean, Chicago last year had a lot of elite metrics, but I don't think even the GM would have told you that they expected to push as far as they did, especially with how strong some of the other AL teams were coming into the playoffs. And so, in my opinion, it's showing a lot that the Chicago GM doesn't want to sit on his laurels and wants to kind of continue to retool the team into the best possible iteration into its best possible iteration. That's why a lot of these guys on expiring deals and with bigger money got traded out before the deadline. Left fielder Riley Green, Cheng Hao Guao, the World Series hero and closer last year, Corbin Burns, who was having a fantastic year with them, Sean Lennon, who has been pretty good with them, and then even second baseman Luis Escudero was traded as a depth piece to the other Chicago team. All these guys were guys that made an impact last year. But the fact that this now gives Chicago some flexibility going into another offseason means that they may be looking to push for a bigger move either financially or by trade to reshape the organization the way that they want.
Fortunately for Chicago, they did keep around a number of the great contributors to their title run. Cooper Pratt still signed long term. Mackenzie Gore has 2 more years here. And most significantly, right before the season, Santiago Suarez signed a 4 year extension. I think he's one of the more underrated pitchers in the league. He was with Tampa for a little bit, then he moved over to Chicago and had a really strong year. And then last year, he won the World Series with them, obviously.
I want to touch on Gore real quick before we move on because Gore is actually on a very, very nice contract for the White Sox, currently being paid $40 million this year, but that is a heavily front loaded deal. The number moves down to 20 million per year the next year, and then 16 per million with a team option after that. For a pitcher that, as soon as he stepped foot in Chicago, has just done nothing but shove, that's excellent. And with him showing no signs currently of slowing down, it's a big luxury to have this veteran starting pitcher as a reclamation project when he was not doing so well in Baltimore prior to coming over.
And now, finally, for the third best record in the American League, come the Minnesota Twins, who are currently leading the division by 9 games upon this recording, and who have made a strong push to continue their dominant run in the division, alongside the acquisitions of Spencer Torkelson, Joe Mizek last year, and the newly extended John Klein.
Minnesota actually has been one of the biggest surprises of the season for me. I mean, they're not quite as flashy as some of the other guys like Colorado, Arizona, or Las Vegas, but they're right up there in terms of being one of the best teams in baseball. 65 and 47 record as of the time of this recording. Pretty much every metric they're in top 3 or top 5. Third in runs scored, second in starters ERA, third in bullpen ERA. And top to bottom, this team has actually performed really well. I know that we talked about this on the preseason pod about how we really like some of the offseason acquisitions that they made. But in my opinion, I don't think even we thought that it would turn out this well.
No, and a lot of that can be put on the performance of the starting rotation for Minnesota. Even in a year where John Klein, their de facto ace, has actually been worse than expected, the other starters have picked up the slack beautifully. Friner Mejias, who came over from Detroit a couple of years ago in a huge blockbuster, has been nothing short of spectacular for the team this year. He did lose a little bit of stamina, which is going to limit his innings this year, but with a 98th percentile hard hit rate and his curveball being worth almost 18 runs, he's by far the best number 2 in the league. He would easily front a rotation on any number of teams.
Yeah, there's a lot to like about how the Twins are constructed. And, unfortunately for them, I think that they kind of realized that a little too late. First off, they do have a ton of money available right now and a ton available next year. They still can very much make another splash in free agency if they so choose. But I need to highlight a couple of things in that one, guys like Joe Mizak, who we saw in the preseason pod as more of a minor move in a trade after he had a decent debut in St. Louis, he is totally turned it on here in Minnesota. He's posting 97th percentile run value. He's elite in pretty much every metric, and he's totally putting up one of the better seasons in Top Shelf in terms of being the total package. At the same time, the pickup of Spencer Torkelson has been great. He's at a 141 OPS plus, tracking for 36 home runs, and getting right where he left off from his last great season in Detroit.
Like you said, Joe Mizek, we mentioned him briefly in the preseason pod, and he's the breakout star of the year. He's had fantastic plate discipline. He's in the 80th or higher percentile in almost all of these major batting categories, and he provides plus defense at second base, which is fantastic. He's on track for 5.1 WAR. He's at 3.5 currently on August 9th, and his ratings continue to go up. I think when he was acquired, it was about at a 48.50, and now he's at 56.56 according to my scout. So he could definitely be one of the stars of the future in Minnesota, and he's still going to be on a minimum deal for another 2 years.
Now, I do want to point out that very early on in their season, they did trade away their closer, David Hageman. And I think that that was maybe a response to a slower start to the year and not really expecting this team to blossom as much as it did. Now, don't get me wrong. They have the third best bullpen ERA in all of the American League. So it's not like the bullpen is a strict weakness. But it will be interesting to see whether or not they have an issue with not having a super established closer with experience come playoff time. They have someone with great talent in Anderson Ramos. He is absolutely the type of pitcher, when you look at him, that fits the bill. He's fully developed, 79-79, and pitching very well this season so far. But he only has 8 saves, and he doesn't have a ton of ninth inning experience. And as we know, we've seen sometimes that even the best rated young closers can have issues when it comes to the pressure of playoff time.
Yeah, I dealt with that a little bit when Ryan Harbin was first getting established in Seattle. It took a little bit for him to get going from being kind of like a righty specialist. And Anderson Ramos does have similar ratings to Ryan Harbin, a lot weaker against the left side than the right side. But fortunately, he has a 35% K rate already and a 186 Sierra. So you can tell from the Sierra, contrary to the FIP, the more accurate representation of a pitcher's current performance. And when it's way lower than your ERA, that's a sign that you're looking for positive regression, essentially. Anderson Ramos, if he's already at a 3.02 ERA, maybe he brings it down to like a 2.2 by the end of the season. I mean, he's up to a 79 for me with two elite pitches and 55 control. Usually with these guys, you see worse control with high stuff, but he seems to be the whole package. So if he can really get it going at the end of this year, then maybe Minnesota can transition that into a full time role for him in the future and sign him long term before he gets too expensive.
2032 seems to be the dawn of a new age here in Top Shelf, with our established contenders being challenged by exciting young rosters across the board. We can't wait to see what's in store during the stretch run. Thank you as always for tuning in to another episode of Spreadsheets and Sliders, and we'll see you next offseason. Play ball!